Behind David Cronenberg's grotesque masterpiece of body horror lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets. From comedy legend Mel Brooks hiding his involvement to avoid laughs, to puppeteers forgotten underground while covered in blood, to a baboon that literally broke down a door to escape. The film's iconic tagline, gruesome special effects, and tragic love story mask some of the strangest behind-the-scenes stories in 1980s cinema. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about The Fly. Fact 1. Mel Brooks secretly produced it. When most people think of Mel Brooks, they picture comedy classics like Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, or Spaceballs. But in 1986, the legendary comedian took on a very different kind of project. Brooks served as one of the main producers of The Fly through his production company, Brooks Films, but he made a deliberate decision to keep his involvement as quiet as possible. The reason was simple. He was genuinely worried that if audiences knew his name was attached to the film, they would automatically assume it was some kind of horror comedy or parody, instead of the serious, terrifying body horror film that director David Cronenberg had created. Brooks had actually produced several non-comedy films before The Fly, including the critically acclaimed drama The Elephant Man in 1980, which he had worked on with producer Stuart Kornfeld. When Kornfeld approached Brooks with the idea of remaking The Fly, Brooks was immediately interested and put up $1 million to get the movie into production after 20th Century Fox initially turned down the project. Brooks believed strongly in the film's potential and actively encouraged Cronenberg to push the boundaries as far as possible. According to Cronenberg, Brooks told him, "I want you to go all the way. Let yourself go and don't hold back," giving the director complete creative freedom to make the film as graphic and disturbing as he wanted without worrying about mainstream audience appeal. Despite his behind-the-scenes efforts to stay out of the spotlight during production, Brooks couldn't resist having a little fun when people eventually discovered his involvement. At the film's premiere, he fully embraced the connection by handing out novelty dealy boppers, those springy headbands with bouncing balls that resembled insect antennae. The gamble of keeping quiet paid off, as The Fly became a critical and commercial success, earning $60 million at the box office on a $15 million budget and winning an Academy Award for Best Makeup. Brooks's strategy of staying in the background helped ensure that audiences took the film seriously as the horrifying tragedy it was meant to be. Fact 2. Brooks invented the iconic tagline. One of the most memorable lines in horror movie history almost never made it into The Fly at all. The tagline, "Be afraid, be very afraid," wasn't part of the original script that David Cronenberg wrote, and it definitely wasn't something the filmmakers had planned from the beginning. Instead, this instantly recognizable phrase came from an unexpected source during production: comedy legend Mel Brooks himself, who was producing the film through his company Brooks Films. During a production meeting, Cronenberg and Brooks were discussing how the characters in the film should react as Seth Brundle's transformation from human to insect hybrid becomes more obvious and disturbing. In Cronenberg's rewritten version of the script, he had included a line where one character reassures another by saying, "Don't be afraid." When Brooks heard this line, he immediately saw an opportunity to flip it into something more powerful and unsettling. According to Cronenberg, Brooks suggested that the response to that line should be, "Yes, be afraid, be very afraid," and the director thought it was absolutely brilliant. The line ended up being spoken by Geena Davis's character Veronica in the film, and it resonated so strongly with audiences that it became one of the movie's main taglines in all the advertising and promotional materials. In fact, Brooks was so confident in the phrase that he insisted on making it the most prominent text right underneath the film's title on posters and ads, reading, "The Fly, be afraid, be very afraid." The tagline captured the public's imagination and became one of the most widely recognized horror catchphrases of the 1980s. It's been referenced, parodied, and borrowed by countless other films, television shows, and media over the decades since. The phrase even earned a nomination from the American Film Institute as one of the greatest movie quotes of all time. What makes this story particularly interesting is that it came from Brooks, a filmmaker best known for comedy classics like Young Frankenstein and Blazing Saddles, proving that his instincts for what makes a line memorable extended far beyond just making people laugh. Fact 3. The baboon broke the telepod door. Working with animals on a film set is never easy. But the production of The Fly in 1986 learned this lesson the hard way when their primate co-star decided he'd had enough of the telepod. The baboon used in the film was named Typhoon, and while he may have looked calm on camera, behind the scenes he was anything but cooperative. Typhoon was a genuine wild animal, not a trained actor, and the film crew quickly discovered that managing him during the telepod scenes would be one of their biggest challenges. The telepods in the movie are these large cylindrical chambers with bright flashing lights inside, designed to look futuristic and scientific. For the scenes where Seth Brundle successfully teleports a baboon to prove his invention works, Typhoon had to be placed inside one of these pods while the lights flashed and the special effects team created the illusion of teleportation. The problem was that Typhoon found the whole experience absolutely terrifying. The combination of being confined in a small space with intense strobe lights flashing all around him was more than the baboon could handle. During one particular take, Typhoon became so startled and panicked by the flashing lights that he used his considerable strength to literally break the door off the telepod to escape. Visual effects supervisor Hoyt Yateman recalled that Typhoon was very much a wild animal throughout filming, and this incident proved it beyond any doubt. After the baboon made his dramatic exit by destroying the pod door, it fell to Jeff Goldblum, who stands 6 feet 4 inches tall, and Typhoon's professional wrangler to work together to keep the frightened primate under control. The production team had to be extremely careful during all the baboon scenes, constantly aware that they were working with an unpredictable wild animal who could have another panic attack at any moment. Fact 4. Vincent Price thought it went too far. When The Fly was released in 1986, star Jeff Goldblum did something that showed real class and respect for film history. He sat down and wrote a personal letter to Vincent Price, the legendary horror actor who had starred in the original 1958 version of The Fly. In his letter, Goldblum expressed his admiration for Price's work and humbly told him, "I hope you like it as much as I liked yours." It was a genuine gesture from one actor to another, acknowledging the legacy Price had created nearly 3 decades earlier. Vincent Price was deeply touched by Goldblum's thoughtful letter and decided he wanted to see what this new generation had done with the story. So Price went to a theater and sat down to watch David Cronenberg's remake. What happened next reveals just how different the two versions really were. Price, who had seen plenty of horror in his long career, found himself genuinely disturbed by certain elements of the film. After watching it, he wrote back to Goldblum with his honest reaction. In his response, Price told Goldblum that he thought the film was wonderful right up to a certain point, but then added that it went a little too far. This diplomatic but clear assessment came from a man who had spent decades making horror films and knew the genre inside and out. While Price appreciated the craftsmanship and the emotional story, the graphic body horror and gruesome special effects pushed beyond what he considered appropriate or necessary. The original 1958 film had been relatively tame by comparison, relying more on suspense and the audience's imagination rather than showing every grotesque detail of the transformation. This exchange between the two actors highlights the massive shift in horror filmmaking between the 1950s and the 1980s. What Cronenberg and his team considered essential to telling an honest story about physical deterioration and disease was, to Price's sensibilities, simply excessive. Despite his reservations, Price's response remained respectful and acknowledged the quality of the remake, even if it wasn't entirely to his taste. Fact 5. Named after a race car driver. David Cronenberg named his main character Seth Brundle after a real Formula One racing driver named Martin Brundle, and the irony of this choice is almost too perfect to be accidental. Martin Brundle was a British racing driver who competed in Formula One throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, driving for teams like Tyrrell, Zakspeed, Brabham, and Benetton. He was known for his skill behind the wheel and later became one of the most respected motorsport commentators in the world. Cronenberg, who has always been a passionate motor racing enthusiast, has a habit of pulling character names from the world of racing, and he openly admitted this in his commentary track for the film. He explained that for some reason he just finds himself drawn to names from the annals of motor racing history when creating his characters, and Seth Brundle was no exception. The delicious irony here is that while the real Martin Brundle made his living by traveling at incredibly high speeds in some of the fastest vehicles on Earth, the fictional Seth Brundle suffers from severe chronic motion sickness that makes even basic travel absolutely miserable for him. In fact, Seth's entire motivation for inventing the telepods in the first place is specifically to avoid having to travel in cars, planes, trains, or any other vehicle, because the motion makes him so sick. His dream is to be able to move from place to place instantly without having to endure the nausea and discomfort of conventional transportation. The character literally dedicated his entire scientific career to solving a problem that the man he was named after would have found completely foreign, since Martin Brundle spent decades comfortably racing at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. The sequel to The Fly carried the reference even further by naming Seth Brundle's son Martin, creating a nice full-circle tribute to the racing driver who inspired the original character's name. It's the kind of subtle inside joke that Cronenberg clearly enjoyed, layering a private bit of humor into an otherwise deeply tragic horror story. Fact 6. Puppeteers were forgotten. Under the floor. One of the most bizarre and uncomfortable experiences during the making of The Fly happened to the crew members working on the inside-out baboon scene, and it had nothing to do with the gruesome special effects they were creating. For this particularly disturbing sequence, the production required 3 puppeteers to work underneath the floor of the set, completely hidden from view while they brought the grotesque puppet to life. 2 of these puppeteers were responsible for animating the inside-out baboon creature, manipulating its movements to make it appear realistic and horrifying, while a 3rd person operated a pump to spray blood during the scene. Because of the enormous amount of fake blood being used, all 3 puppeteers had to wear raincoats just to protect themselves from getting completely drenched. And even with that protection, they were still getting splattered constantly throughout the filming process. The real problem came during breaks in production. Multiple times throughout the shoot, the cast and crew would wrap up a take and head off to lunch, completely forgetting that the 3 puppeteers were still trapped underneath the floor in their raincoats, covered in fake blood and unable to get out on their own. The puppeteers would be left there waiting in the dark, cramped space while everyone else enjoyed their meal break, only to be remembered later when production was ready to resume filming. This wasn't just a one-time mistake either. It happened repeatedly during the production of that particular scene, turning what was already a physically demanding and messy job into an even more uncomfortable experience for the crew members stuck below. To make matters worse, the puppeteers working on the final scene of the film found their own way to cope with the boredom and discomfort of their position. While animating effects for actor John Getz, who played Stathis Borans, the puppeteers glued pictures to his foot that was positioned under the floor and even dipped it in oatmeal as a prank. Getz later admitted that he should have realized he would be an easy target since he was completely unable to move during filming. Fact 7. Goldblum's jealousy disrupted filming. When production began on The Fly in December of 1985, Jeff Goldblum and Geena Davis were already a couple, having been together for some time before filming started. Director David Cronenberg was actually hesitant to cast Davis as Veronica Quaife specifically because she and Goldblum were dating, knowing that working with real-life couples could create complications on set. However, after Davis delivered a strong first reading, Cronenberg was convinced she was perfect for the role and decided to take the risk. The problem Cronenberg had worried about did eventually materialize during filming, though perhaps not in the way anyone expected. The film's plot required Veronica to have scenes with her ex-boyfriend and editor Stathis Borans, played by actor John Getz, and these scenes were meant to show some lingering tension and history between the characters. As cameras rolled on these emotionally charged moments between Davis and Getz, Goldblum found himself struggling with jealousy while watching his real-life girlfriend perform intimate or emotional scenes with another actor. Goldblum later admitted in special features documentaries that he became emotionally attached to what was happening on screen and couldn't separate the fiction from reality. He would hover around the set during Davis and Getz's scenes together, clearly uncomfortable with the dynamic between the two characters. At one point, the situation became distracting enough that Cronenberg had to politely ask Goldblum to leave the set entirely so they could complete the scenes without his anxious presence affecting the performances. Cronenberg also noted in his audio commentary that the real-life relationship between Goldblum and Davis actually affected their on-screen chemistry in unexpected ways. Davis, who was an adept mimic, would sometimes unconsciously adopt Goldblum's mannerisms and speech patterns during their scenes together, which Cronenberg found both helpful and challenging to work around. Despite these behind-the-scenes complications, the couple's genuine connection translated into believable on-screen chemistry that helped make the film's tragic love story emotionally resonant. Goldblum and Davis would go on to marry in 1987 during the filming of another movie together, Earth Girls Are Easy, though they eventually divorced in 1990. Fact 8. Martin Scorsese inspired Cronenberg's cameo. During a casual meeting with legendary director Martin Scorsese in the 1980s, David Cronenberg received an unexpected compliment that would lead to one of the film's most memorable cameos. After watching some of Cronenberg's early work, Scorsese was eager to meet the Canadian filmmaker, and when they finally sat down together, Scorsese made an unusual observation about Cronenberg's appearance. He told Cronenberg that he looked like a Beverly Hills plastic surgeon, a comment that stuck with the director and sparked an idea that would add another layer of dark humor to The Fly. The comment came at just the right time, as Cronenberg was already deep into production on The Fly and looking for ways to add subtle touches to the film. According to Gina Davis, who played Veronica Quaife in the movie, it was actually her idea to have Cronenberg appear in the film as a doctor. She suggested that he take on a small role in the nightmare sequence, where her character gives birth to a giant maggot, one of the film's most disturbing scenes. Cronenberg loved the idea, and with Scorsese's observation still fresh in his mind, he decided to play a gynecologist in the scene, leaning into the clinical, detached demeanor that Scorsese had apparently seen in him. The cameo itself is brief but memorable, with Cronenberg appearing in full medical attire during Veronica's horrifying dream sequence. He delivers his lines with a professional calmness that makes the nightmare even more unsettling, as the absurdity of the situation contrasts sharply with his matter-of-fact medical approach. The role fit perfectly with Cronenberg's reputation as a director who explores the body and medical procedures with unflinching detail, and it became one of those insider moments that fans of the film love to point out. What started as a casual remark from one legendary director to another ended up creating a darkly comedic moment that perfectly captured Cronenberg's unique sensibility. Fact 9. Melting eyeballs made from condoms. When it came time to create one of the most disturbing visual effects in The Fly, the special effects team had to get creative with some very unconventional materials. The scene where Brundlefly's eyeballs literally melt and ooze down his deteriorating face required makeup artist Chris Wallace and his crew to think outside the box, and what they came up with was equal parts genius and disgusting. The melting eyeballs that horrified audiences in 1986 were actually constructed using condoms, KY jelly, and shredded rubber, proving that sometimes the most effective special effects come from the strangest combinations of household items. The process of creating this effect was just as bizarre as it sounds. The team needed something that could hold liquid, appear translucent like an actual eyeball, and convincingly melt on camera without looking fake or theatrical. Condoms turned out to be the perfect material because they could be filled with the gooey mixture and shaped to resemble the curve and texture of a human eye. The KY jelly provided the wet, viscous consistency that made the effect look genuinely organic and nauseating, while the shredded rubber added texture and made the whole thing appear more fleshy and realistic as it dissolved. This wasn't the only time the makeup department used unexpected materials to achieve their gruesome effects throughout the film. Chris Wallace and his team, who won an Academy Award for Best Makeup for their work on The Fly, created more than 24 different special effects and puppets during production, often relying on practical materials and old-school techniques rather than any kind of digital enhancement. The condom eyeballs were just one example of how the crew had to improvise and experiment to bring David Cronenberg's vision of biological horror to life. The fact that these melting eyeballs still hold up today as genuinely disturbing is a testament to the ingenuity and creativity of the practical effects artists who worked on the film. Fact 10. A professional boxer lost the arm wrestling match. In one of the film's most brutal and memorable scenes, Seth Brundle walks into a bar and challenges a muscular patron named Marky to an arm wrestling match, betting $100 and a night with his female companion. What makes this scene particularly interesting is that the actor playing Marky, the unfortunate victim whose arm gets gruesomely snapped in half, was George Chuvalo, a legendary Canadian heavyweight boxer. Chuvalo wasn't just any boxer brought in for a minor role. He was one of the most respected fighters of his era, known for never being knocked down in his entire professional career despite facing opponents like Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, and Joe Frazier. Having a real heavyweight champion play the role of someone who gets completely overpowered adds an extra layer of irony to the scene that most viewers would never catch. The casting choice was typical of David Cronenberg's attention to detail and his love of subtle touches that reward observant viewers. By having an actual professional fighter in the role, the scene becomes even more impactful, because Chuvalo's physical presence and genuine strength make Seth's newfound superhuman power that much more believable and terrifying. When a man who fought Muhammad Ali gets his arm broken like a twig, it really drives home just how much the teleportation accident has transformed Seth Brundle into something far beyond human. The scene itself remains one of the most difficult moments to watch in the entire film, with the compound fracture shown in graphic detail as bone tears through skin. Chuvalo's high-pitched scream of agony in the scene adds to the disturbing nature of the moment, making it unforgettable for anyone who's seen the movie. This wasn't just a random casting decision, but a deliberate choice to make the arm wrestling scene as visceral and shocking as possible by using someone whose real-world toughness made Seth's violence all the more horrifying. Fact 11. Deleted scene. Was too disturbing. One of the most infamous deleted scenes from The Fly involves a moment so dark and grotesque that director David Cronenberg and the production team decided it would completely destroy audience sympathy for Seth Brundle. In the scene, which was fully filmed and can now be found in the special features of various DVD and Blu-ray releases, Seth sends both a baboon and a house cat into the telepod together in what appears to be another one of his increasingly reckless experiments. The result is a nightmarish hybrid creature that combines the worst features of both animals, creating an ultra-violent mutation that's neither baboon nor cat, but something horrifically in between. The creature that emerges from the telepod is so aggressive and uncontrollable that Seth has no choice but to grab a lead pipe and beat the mutated animal to death right there in his laboratory. The scene was shot with full practical effects, and the violence was reportedly quite graphic and disturbing to watch. According to members of the production team, this sequence appeared in early test screenings of the film, but audience reactions made it clear that watching the protagonist brutally kill an innocent animal he had created was simply too much. Viewers found it impossible to maintain any emotional connection with Seth after witnessing him commit such an act, even though the creature was dangerous and attacking him. The decision to cut the scene wasn't just about the violence itself, but about preserving the delicate balance Cronenberg had created throughout the film. The entire movie works because audiences feel genuine sympathy and heartbreak for Seth Brundle as he slowly loses his humanity, and this deleted scene threatened to tip that balance too far. Instead of seeing Seth as a tragic victim of a scientific accident, viewers would see him as someone capable of creating life just to destroy it in the most brutal way possible. The scene also featured what would have been Stage 4B of Jeff Goldblum's makeup transformation, a version that required him to wear one of two full-body foam latex suits, since Brundle had stopped wearing clothing by that point in his deterioration. Fact 12. Geena Davis's shock was real. One of the most unsettling moments in The Fly happens when Seth Brundle's ear suddenly falls off his head while he's talking to Veronica. And the shock you see on Geena Davis's face in that scene wasn't acting at all, because she had absolutely no idea it was about to happen. The special effects team and director David Cronenberg deliberately kept Davis in the dark about when the ear would actually detach, and they filmed her genuine reaction of horror and disgust when Jeff Goldblum's prosthetic ear dropped off during the take. This decision to surprise the actress was intentional because Cronenberg wanted to capture a completely authentic moment of revulsion and disbelief, the kind of visceral response that would be nearly impossible to fake convincingly even for a talented performer. Davis later confirmed in interviews that her shocked expression was 100% real, And you can tell when you watch the scene because there's something unmistakably genuine about the way she recoils and the look of absolute horror that crosses her face. The moment has become one of the film's most memorable scenes, partly because of how authentic that reaction feels, and it perfectly captures the tragedy of watching someone you love literally fall apart in front of you. Cronenberg was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his willingness to push boundaries to get the most realistic performances possible. And keeping Davis unaware of exactly when the prosthetic would fall was just one example of how he crafted those deeply uncomfortable moments that made The Fly so effective as both a horror film and a tragic love story. The ear falling off marked a turning point in the film where Seth's transformation became undeniably horrific and irreversible, and Davis's genuine shock helped sell that moment to audiences in a way that a prepared performance might not have achieved. Fact 13. The telepods were inspired by a motorcycle. When David Cronenberg sat down to design the iconic telepods for The Fly, he didn't look to science fiction movies or futuristic technology for inspiration. Instead, he turned to something much more personal and grounded in his everyday life: his beloved Ducati Desmo motorcycle. The cylindrical shape of the telepods, which became one of the most recognizable visual elements of the film, was directly modeled after the engine cylinder of Cronenberg's own bike. This might seem like an unusual choice for a piece of advanced teleportation technology, but it perfectly reflects Cronenberg's approach to filmmaking, where he often blends the familiar with the strange to create something uniquely unsettling. Before settling on the motorcycle-inspired design, the production team actually considered several other options for how the telepods should look. Early concepts included making them look like glass shower stalls or phone booths, which would have given the film a very different visual feel. These designs were much more conventional and expected for a science fiction movie, but Cronenberg felt they lacked the right aesthetic. The director wanted something that felt both mechanical and organic, industrial yet sleek, and the smooth curves and technical precision of a motorcycle engine cylinder fit that vision perfectly. Cronenberg has always been a motor racing enthusiast, and his passion for fast vehicles and mechanical engineering shows up throughout his work on The Fly. This wasn't just about creating something that looked cool on screen. The cylindrical design also served a practical purpose during filming, as it made the pods easier to light and shoot from multiple angles. The reflective surfaces and curved glass created interesting visual effects that enhanced the mysterious, almost otherworldly quality of the teleportation process. What started as a simple idea borrowed from Cronenberg's garage ended up becoming one of the most memorable and distinctive props in 1980s horror cinema. Fact 14. The vomit was eggs and honey. One of the most memorable and disgusting elements of The Fly is the acidic vomit that Seth Brundle uses to dissolve his food, and later in the film, to attack people who get in his way. What makes this effect even more disturbing is knowing exactly what the actors were actually dealing with during those scenes. The special effects team created the vomit using a surprisingly simple recipe made from milk, eggs, and honey, mixed together to create a thick, goopy substance that looked absolutely revolting on camera. The combination of these three ordinary kitchen ingredients produced a viscous liquid that had just the right consistency and color to look like corrosive bile being expelled from a mutating human-fly hybrid. While the mixture was technically edible and non-toxic, which was important for the safety of the actors and crew, it still looked and behaved in a way that perfectly captured the grotesque nature of Brundle's deteriorating condition. The effects team had to get the proportions exactly right, so the substance would pour and splatter convincingly while also maintaining its disgusting appearance under the hot movie lights. Jeff Goldblum had to work with this mixture in multiple scenes, including the unforgettable moment when he vomits on his food to begin digesting it externally, just like a real fly would do. The scene where Brundlefly attacks Stathis by spitting acidic vomit on his hand and foot also required careful choreography with this egg and honey mixture to make it look like the substance was actually melting human flesh. The practical effects team then combined this practical liquid with clever camera work and additional prosthetic effects to sell the illusion that the vomit was truly corrosive. This simple but effective recipe is a perfect example of how 1980s horror films achieved their most shocking moments without computer-generated imagery, relying instead on creativity, practical ingenuity, and a willingness to make actors work with some genuinely unpleasant materials to get the perfect shot. Fact 15. Cronenberg almost directed Total Recall. Instead, David Cronenberg's involvement with The Fly in 1986 was actually the result of a completely different science fiction project falling apart at exactly the right moment. Before he ever considered remaking The Fly, Cronenberg had committed to directing Total Recall, the ambitious adaptation of a Philip K. Dick story that would eventually become the Arnold Schwarzenegger blockbuster in 1990. The Canadian director was deep into pre-production work on Total Recall with producer Dino De Laurentiis when the two men had a serious falling out over the creative direction of the film. The disagreement was significant enough that Cronenberg decided to walk away from the project entirely, leaving Total Recall without a director and Cronenberg suddenly available for new work. This timing turned out to be perfect because producer Stuart Kornfeld had been struggling to find the right director for the Fly remake after another filmmaker named Robert Bierman had withdrawn from the project following a family tragedy. When Kornfeld learned that Cronenberg was unexpectedly free, he jumped at the opportunity and convinced Mel Brooks to increase the budget offer from $750,000 to $1 million to secure Cronenberg's participation. Cronenberg's departure from Total Recall created a domino effect that shaped the future of both films in completely different ways. Without Cronenberg, Total Recall eventually landed in the hands of Dutch director Paul Verhoeven, who brought his own distinct vision of extreme violence and satirical action to the material when the film finally reached theaters 4 years later in 1990. Meanwhile, Cronenberg took The Fly in a deeply personal direction that emphasized psychological horror and body deterioration as a metaphor for disease and aging, creating what many consider his masterpiece and certainly his most commercially successful film. The Fly earned $60 million at the box office and won an Academy Award for makeup, while Total Recall became a different kind of hit with its over-the-top action sequences and memorable one-liners, proving that sometimes the best creative decisions happen by accident.